Hi, I'm Sheila James Kuehl. Welcome to Get Used to It. This is our monthly show, although some of you may watch it more often, on issues of interest to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered community. And today we're going to talk about an issue that's been of interest to every single person in the world, as far as I can tell, at least for more than the last year, and that is domestic violence. Now, domestic violence, as we normally hear about it, is domestic violence in the heterosexual community. However, it is not only a dirty little secret in every heterosexual community, it's a dirty little secret in the lesbian gay community. And today, by talking about it, we hope that we can bring some information that will be of help to you if you're a victim, if you're a batterer, if you're a concerned family member or friend. We want to talk about how these issues are similar for our community, how they might be different, and we're very happy to have you with us. I'm extremely happy also to have you with us, since you're our guests, and I'd like to introduce our guests today. First, Dr. Val Coleman, who is a therapist who specializes in working with both victims and people who perpetrate violence, lesbian and gay, and has written her doctoral dissertation on this issue of violence in lesbian relationships. Welcome, Val.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is Jan Fogelman. Jan is a doctoral student, soon to be Dr. Fogelman. Yes. His dissertation will be on the issue of developing guidelines for batterers treatment programs specifically for members of our community, and he is the co-facilitator of a group for battering gays and or lesbians at the LA Gay and Lesbian Community Services Center. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you.
That's a lot of mouthful of all titles and things, right? And I've still got one to go. Our third guest today is Lara Bloomquist, who is the director of the Vertical Prosecution Unit on Domestic Violence at the LA City Attorney's Office, and has seen a few, though not very many, cases coming to the City Attorney's Office of domestic violence in our community. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Val, let me start by asking you, because we probably have thousands and thousands of people watching our show across the country, and even though we've, as I said, we've gotten a lot of, I wouldn't even call it information, but there's certainly been a lot of interest about domestic violence, but I'm not sure that people really quite get it in terms of just the dynamics generally, not only for the lesbian gay community, but just out in the world. What sort of is domestic violence 101A?
Okay.
What are the dynamics of a battering relationship as you've seen them?
Okay. Well, actually, first what I'd like to do is sort of just start with the definition of battering in domestic violence, because a lot of people are not, even sure what those terms mean. And I guess a good way to think about it, or a helpful way to think about it, is that battering or domestic violence is sort of the use of intimidation, coercion, terrorism, violence, to sort of control or kind of, assume and use power over someone else, to kind of get them to do things that you feel like you would like them to do. So that can be a range of things. It could be physical violence, sexual violence, emotional and psychological abuse, or all of those things. But it's a pattern of intimidation and control, really.
Threats would count too.
So threats
I don't
would
mean
count.
just count like in the legal definition, but it seems as though in a number of relationships you see that one person's kind of afraid of the other person.
Right.
But you say, well, has he ever hit you? And they say, well, no. But there's still some dynamic there, and the reason he hasn't hit you is because you've done absolutely everything he demanded you do.
Right.
So there's some aspect of sort of altering your own life to try to keep from having this kind of abuse.
Yeah, because if you, let's say I'm someone who is a batterer and you're my partner, I may not ever have to hit you, but if you've done something that displeases me and I give you a look that's really terrifying or very intimidating, you know that if you do that again, or if you sort of, step out of line, that it could move into physical violence. And so you start to feel very intimidated and sort of have that walking on eggshells kind of feeling, and start to kind of want to second guess me so that you don't do anything to upset me.
But the mythology about this is that somebody just went out of control. They couldn't control themselves and they hit you, and of course they're sorry and you forgive them. So that I think, again, people generally looking in the fishbowl of a relationship say, well, you know, I don't get this.
Yeah, I think that's a very common misperception in terms of people thinking that the batterer has just gone out of control. And for the batterer themselves, oftentimes batterers feel like, you know, I just lost control, and it's really myself who's being victimized here. You hurt my feelings, and I'm just, you know, it's the only way I have to let you know about that, or, you know, try to get back at you in some way. But the reality is that battering and the use of intimidation, it is about power and control, and taking and abusing power and control in a relationship over someone else. And oftentimes, and I'm sure that you'll talk more about this having worked with batterers, you know, batterers make choices in terms of the abuse that they, you know, do, and choices about how to abuse, those kinds of things that sometimes they're not so conscious of.
Well, I know a lot of people say, well, what is it that causes domestic violence? And I like to say, you know, it would be the same if you asked a question, what causes a hammer? I mean, violence is a tool, essentially, that someone will use to take power over someone else. And of course, the most commonly asked question in domestic violence is, why doesn't she leave?
Yeah.
I mean, people say, people who feel more empowered than victims feel, I would get out. First sign of something like that, boy, I would get out. Why doesn't she leave?
Well, it's a very complicated, complex situation, really. And what, you know, for one thing, batterers actually have many tactics that they use to sort of, you know, achieve enhanced power and control over their partner. Isolating the victim, intimidating, threatening, calling names, sort of both physical means and very psychological means. So what happens for the victim is that they often feel like, you know, there is no way out, and they become sort of really locked into this psychological control with the batterer. And I think that there are two helpful ways of thinking about it. One is about the cycle of violence, which Lenore Walker first identified, you know, sort of the late 70s, and I can sort of go through that and explain what that is.
Please.
The cycle of violence is sort of a cycle that we frequently see in relationships, and that the violence increases in frequency and severity over time. And I guess, you know, one way to think about it is how when, you know, you get involved with someone, initially there's sort of a, you know, kind of bonding, and the person that you're involved with is very charismatic, very loving, very caring. You come together for what seem like really good reasons, and then there's some tension that may start to build. And often in battering relationships, what you see is the batterer becoming a bit more controlling and, you know, sort of more possessive, a little bit jealous. And at first that may feel very flattering to the partner. You know, they want to be with me all the time. That feels really great.
They don't want me to be with other
right,
people.
They don't want me to
They're
be with
jealous.
other people.
Isn't that cute?
Right. You know, I feel so special and wanted. And then what happens is, so that's sort of the initial phase up here. Then you move into sort of some tension, because, you know, all of a sudden you realize that you're being restricted in a way, or there might be some little fights that develop.
You feel some tension building in the batterer too.
Yes.
I mean, there's this barely controlled kind of temper thing.
Right. Becoming very angry about, you know, feeling like, you know, your attention is directed elsewhere. I told you not to talk to those people, or why are you going out with her? You know that upsets me. Why don't you want to spend time with me? Those kinds of things. And so there's tension that's building in the relationship. And then there can be what's sort of called a minor incident, which may be a fight or a verbal argument. Doesn't have to be physical at that point, but it could be. And then after the minor incident, there's a more serious incident, usually. And that often, if the minor incident has been some sort of verbal argument, the major incident may be some physical violence, such as a push or a shove. It could be a batterer, you know, coming home and sort of having a very bad, stressful day, wanting dinner to be ready, not wanting you to be on the phone talking to your friend, exploding, blowing up, throwing things, hitting you, those sorts of things, ripping the phone cord out of the wall. And then after that incident, there's a honeymoon phase. Now this has a lot to do with why people stay in the relationship. That in that honeymoon phase, the batterer expresses a great deal of sorrow. It's very apologetic. And often, my experience anyway, has been that for many batterers, they genuinely feel sorry about it. They sort of feel like, you know, I don't know why I got so out of control, you know, but if you if you didn't do those things that made me so upset, you know, I don't like it when dinner's not ready on time, or when, you know, you're
something
talking
you
on the phone.
did.
Yeah.
People often say that to you too.
Right.
Well, he did. What did you do? What did you do to make him mad?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, what happens is that the battered spouse or partner starts to feel like, wow, maybe it is something that I did. I better stop. You know, that makes him or her so upset. Why do I keep doing those things? And they start to change their behavior. And they start to feel like the batterer is maybe really going to change because they're so apologetic. They're bringing flowers. They're saying, you know, I won't do that ever again. So there's all of this hope and there's this reuniting that happens. You know, and the other thing that goes along with that we've learned from sort of hostage syndrome is that there's also this intense bonding that can happen between the person that's terrorizing a victim and the victim, where they feel like they're actually being taken care of. And we see it with child abuse as well, you know, where the child is being abused, but the person they have to turn to as a protector is also the abuser. And that happens all the time in domestic violence.
Also an enormous dependency by the batterer. I mean, it's interesting to me as the cycle escalates. After the honeymoon period, the tension builds again. There's a more serious incident, another honeymoon, more serious. But at the moment that also, from my experience, a reason why a victim may not leave as well is that just when they decide they're going to leave, it becomes very dangerous for them.
Very dangerous.
And the batterer may threaten to kill himself or her. Can't make up his mind. Or maybe the children.
Right.
I mean, a lot of very serious threats. And of course, almost 2,000 women we know are killed every year in battering incidents. Let me ask you, Jan, you agreed with a lot of what Val has said about batterers. You work specifically with batterers. Tell us a little more, if you can, about the dynamics of, I mean, what's going on. It's much easier for me to sympathize with the victim. I feel like this batterer is some kind of criminal, and of course, as we'll find out in a minute, he is, or she is. But what's going on with the batterer? What's that dynamic about?
The batterer often feels like a victim himself or herself, and they feel like it's the other person's fault, and that tendency to blame some other person and to lay responsibility on the other is a very common thing for batterers to do. Well, if only he hadn't said that, I wouldn't have had to hit him. Well, I just panicked, and I felt like I just had to do something to get him to stop yelling at me. And that kind of says, well, it was his yelling that really caused this, not my hitting him or her. And so that they often feel the fear of abandonment, like, well, I've got to keep them from leaving. If they leave me, I will be gone. So there's a strong dependency element there, by the batterer feeling dependent on the partner to stay.
And also a lot of possessiveness I've seen too. When you were talking about isolation, I noticed that a lot of times a batterer will say, your mother's a troublemaker, I don't want you talking to her anymore.
She doesn't like me.
Those friends who are, you know, supportive, they're troublemakers, I don't want you seeing them anymore. Do you find that with, in terms of them also blaming other people who have pulled the victims away?
They seem to be experts at identifying other support systems for their partner and getting rid of that support. A lot of it includes homophobic type things, like reminding the partner of, you have nowhere to go. There's nobody who's going to listen to you. A social worker is not going to believe you. In the states where it's still a crime to be gay and lesbian, admitting domestic violence is tantamount to admitting to a crime itself. So it just reinforces the idea the law is not going to be there for you. A judge is not going to believe you.
And of course in heterosexual relationships, because we haven't yet talked about sort of our similarities and differences, but in general, there's this same feeling where a batterer will say, well, they're not going to help you, the courts won't help you, I'll get the kids. You know, the police aren't interested in this, they're going to think you're lying. And he's very cool when the police come, and she, of course, is a wreck because the victim is a wreck from the violence. So it actually works all quite a bit in favor of the batterer.
It does.
But you're working with people who have come to a group. They're not sent to your group.
No,
I mean, the court actually does now sort of sentence people to go to groups, but not gay people, right? They come, or at least not to the center. So they come to you voluntarily. Why do they come to you?
Usually it's out of the remorse, often after having done something and really recognizing that they hurt or damaged the partner. They're truly sorry and regretful. A lot of people also come to us out of repeated failed relationships where they realize this is continuing to not work for me. Something's going on here. Maybe it has to do with my anger. Those little explosions I have sometimes.
Now, is there a program that works for
Yes.
batterers?
Yes.
Works.
And it needs to be long-term. It needs to really focus on challenging the person's use of these tactics to control their partners, but also getting at that feeling of victimization that almost every batterer comes in with, and recognizing the validity of it while challenging their use of tactics on other people, but then long-term support. Like alcoholics or drug users need long-term support, even if it's just to check in once in a while. People need some place to go to get validation and encouragement and support, not to revert to controlling patterns.
Well, now the question is, we heard about the dynamic. Does the law really help or not? We'll be back in a minute.
Pick up your telephone right now and call the number on your screen. Find out how you can enrich your family values by learning about your gay children.
We had no idea what the gay community was like.
Learn how these parents deal with their fears about attending Parents Flag meetings.
One of my biggest fears was that I would see someone that I knew.
Call the telephone number on your screen right now and see how these parents have taken themselves to acceptance and beyond.
Because that parent does not know the positives yet about the gay community.
Hi, welcome back to Get Used to It. I'm your host, Sheila Kuehl, and today we're talking about domestic violence in the lesbian gay community. Not a subject that you hear very much about, so we're happy to be able to do at least an hour on it. We talked with Val Coleman about the dynamics of battering, with Jan Fogelman about batterers' sort of profile and the group that he co-facilitates. And now talked to Lara Bloomquist from the City Attorney's Office in Los Angeles about the law. This was a secret, a sort of a family secret, generally for years in heterosexual families. The law didn't want to intervene, you know, families were not to be interfered with. But finally, I think contiguous with the women's movement in the 70s, women started saying, no, you know, it's my law too.
Right.
I think it really ought to work for us. Will you tell us a little bit about what the law, at least in California, will do in terms of domestic violence?
Well, certainly for the, as it will do for the heterosexual, it will do for the homosexual, assuming that you have a willing law enforcement agency and a willing prosecutorial agency. California has specifically 3 laws that are normally used. One is 273.5, which is our spousal abuse law. We call it spousal abuse, but it doesn't have to be spousal abuse. Actually, it is someone who cohabits with another. That's recently, up until recently, that was specific to heterosexuals. It was a man and a woman. Now that has been removed from the law, and it's anyone who cohabits, with a couple other little provisos in it. But a gay couple living together would certainly qualify under that.
And when you say 273.5, that's the penal code section.
I'm sorry, it's the
so
penal
that means
code.
it's a crime in California.
It's absolutely
right?
a crime. It is a crime to hit or use physical force against anyone, period. And that's of course always been a crime under the battery statutes. You can't commit a battery on someone. But over the years, with spousal abuse coming to the forefront, 273.5 was added to the California statutes, which takes a 6-month high or a 6-month maximum on a 242 of battery, and now makes it a year, and adds several other things with it, domestic violence counseling and that kind of thing. So we have at our disposal a battery statute, the statute for cohabitant abuse, and one for dating relationships, where you haven't lived together or don't live together, but it elevates it to the year maximum.
And in addition, of course, not in the criminal law, as every other state, we have available restraining orders that you can go to the court and get. And now there's a consideration required in custody determinations in terms of the judge having to look at domestic violence in the relationship and then make some decisions about how custody is going to be allocated. But the city attorney's office prosecutes crimes. That's essentially
That's
what
right.
you do.
And actually, a violation of any court order is also a crime. So you can get a temporary restraining order, and a violation of that restraining order is a separate crime in and of itself.
And stalking, too, which is a separate crime. I think California was the first state to enact a stalking statute, because the experience of victims often was that they might not be hit after they've sort of gotten away, but every night, you know, the guy's standing in front of the house, or they're being followed, and it's like a threat.
Oh, it's very much a threat. I mean, as a matter of fact, the law defines it as a credible threat. And that's, you know, it's not just somebody hanging out on your doorstep. I mean, there's an ominousness to it.
Right, and that's the thing I love about this law, is that every year it more reflects the victim's real experience.
Right.
And it was so hard to convince people that that was an important thing, you know, to put in. So how many cases do you prosecute in the city attorney's office in LA over the course of a year?
Domestic violence in and of itself?
Right.
Approximately 13 to 15,000 would. We're just doing new statistics, but it appears that statutes altogether, our various branches, somewhere between 13 and 15,000.
So it must be pretty prevalent in society. I mean, you probably have some statistics.
Yeah, I can give you an idea. What the research has shown in terms of heterosexual couples, and it's a wide range, because of course with research we always end up with various ranges, but anywhere from, I think it's 28% to 55% of all couples, there has been domestic violence, some acts of violence, repeated acts of violence. And there's also been research on gay and lesbian domestic violence.
And is that very different?
It's actually fairly comparable. The rates of those studies show a range of between like 25% to 48%. So really we're looking at very comparable rates between the two.
So Laura, when you prosecute batterers or accused batterers, do you prosecute them in front of a jury?
Yes. No, well, that's dependent upon whether or not the defendant wants to select a jury. He can go in front of a judge and a judge alone, or he can ask for a jury trial. Normally, it's left up. The people have a right to a jury trial as well, but normally it's the defendant who makes the selection.
Now, you hear a lot about recalcitrant witnesses, people complaining, or the mythology out in society, or law enforcement saying, we were here 4 times, we arrested the guy, and then she wouldn't be a witness, so why should we do this anymore? But you've made a different decision in the city attorney's office about prosecuting without a witness.
Yes, we have. We have found that somewhere, and this is a matter of experience for me, and we have no hardcore statistics on it, but somewhere around 75% or better, 75 to 85% of our victims are what we call recanting, which means that once they get to the courtroom, they've been subpoenaed in, now they get to the courtroom, and now the injuries are a result of falling down the stairs, opening the refrigerator door into my head, or whatever it is, or very often I started it. It was all self-defense. I was threatening him with a lamp. He had to hit me. What the outcome to that is that we have no willing victim. We have no witness to get on the stand and now verify what the arrest report says. I mean, the arrest report says that they arrived, police arrived, she was hysterical, she was, you know, had a red swollen cheek and maybe a black eye. She tells them, my husband did this over an argument over money, or whatever the argument is, or in gay relationships over whatever. I mean, it's all the same kind of things. Well, have the same kind of issues. Then that changes. We no longer have anyone to testify to that. It's our position that we are pursuing the cases as if we have no victim, and that is that we are going to prepare our cases for the likelihood that she won't be testifying on our behalf. And so we will go via what's called spontaneous statements, which are her initial statements to the police officer, photographs that the officer has taken at the scene, 911 calls, which are usually very helpful because they're very true. I mean, at that point, she's screaming and she's yelling, and and she wants some kind of help right then and there. Her statements to the officer, anything, or obviously any other witnesses or corroboration that we can find. But we're not going to count on having her. Which means we're going to go more and more
people
without
get
her.
very angry at victims for not testifying, but my experience with them is, I mean, they're righteously afraid. Often they're threatened.
Right.
That's what I would think what any smart batterer would do, is you testify against me and you're dead.
Right.
And that can be by phone call, and that's not very obvious to the prosecutor or whatever.
Well, they're frightened. I mean, there's no doubt that a portion of them are frightened. A whole lot of them are very angry at you for upsetting their life. All they wanted to do was to stop this that night. That Saturday night at 9 o'clock, they just wanted somebody to come by and say, cut it out. And then they wanted to go on to, and now they find themselves in the middle of a criminal prosecution, and they don't want it.
Well, also, this is their relationship. I mean,
absolutely.
We know, and it's sort of a joke, I guess, in the, in the lesbian community, that our relationships never really end, no matter what happens. And I mean, that kind of bonding in both gay and lesbian relationships is, I don't know, I don't mean that it's stronger, but to some extent, because often we're isolated from other parts of the world or from our families, we're even more kind of dependent on that person. Is the dynamic, as we've talked about it, in terms of how violence happens and why it happens, any different in our relationships, Val? The reason I ask is because the final mythology, really, I want to talk about in terms of this is, well, this is about gender. Men are so empowered in the world, and men are violent, and they express themselves aggressively. Women are, raised to be passive, and they don't have the resources in the world, and all of the actual, real, true gender differences that can help that dynamic in a heterosexual relationship, so that we know 96, 97% of batterers in heterosexual relationships are the men.
Yes.
But here we come to our community. Now this doesn't quite work. We've got 2 women, we've got 2 men. How is it different?
Yeah, well, it is, in many ways it's the same in terms of the cycle of violence, the, physical abuse that occurs, all those tactics, many of them are similar, but yes, it's very different in terms of that it doesn't fit into what we have conceived of as being the causes of domestic violence that have to do with the patriarchy and gender and the power of men over women. And the reality is that, again, going back to the definition, that it's really not about male-female, it's about power and control over another person. And there is no, sort of difference, therefore, in terms of who gets to necessarily hold that power. And what we tend to see in gay and lesbian relationships as well is that, it could be the partner that's bigger and stronger or more butch who may be battering. It could also be a partner that's, sort of more feminine or smaller in stature. It doesn't have to, or stature, it doesn't have to necessarily go along any kind of gender or gender role lines. And there are many people who sort of have this sort of butch femme mythology that, gay and lesbian relationships, there's a butch and a femme.
They're all about roles.
Right, it's all about these roles, and that, so if someone's abusing, it's got to be a butch and they're abusing a femme, and it really cuts across all kinds of, different classes, races, roles, etc. And I think, again, it's not at all about gender in and of itself. It is about, in the heterosexual domestic violence, heterosexism and sexism allows men to hold the power and to batter women. And homophobia is a tool in our community that helps keep the silence and helps people sort of maintain and abuse power and control over their partners.
Jan, you find that in your group as well? I mean, that they're, in terms of who has committed the abuse in the relationship?
Well, we really have to do a lot of work at assessing who is doing what, because there is no clear gender differentiation here. In heterosexual couples, like 98% of the victims are women, and the injuries are to women.
Right.
And that just doesn't hold up in same-sex domestic violence.
Because both men are aggressively physical, or?
No, they might not be, but it's 2 men, and nobody can just identify the man as the abuser, or with 2 women, the more butch, or either woman as the abuser.
Does that make it harder for people to kind of tell their story?
Oh, yes.
And get out?
Yes. And it's very difficult for men either heterosexually battered men or gay men to admit having been abused.
Yeah, I think that's general. I think it's very difficult, I think, for people at large to demean themselves or feel that their dignity has been, you know, attacked in some respect, and they have to get up. I know on a witness stand, people have to get up and say, "I've been a victim," and that's, you know, that's something that's kind of demeaning, and it's embarrassing. And
it's embarrassing for everybody, and it's especially embarrassing for men, it seems, to admit they've been injured or abused.
Absolutely.
And especially if they're a bigger, maybe more masculine-looking man, being hit by a smaller man, it makes it even more difficult for them to admit that I'm larger, but I'm still the victim.
Well, we found interestingly enough, we found that males, about 5% of our cases are female defendants, and in heterosexual cases is what I'm talking about. The males are virtually 100% recanting. They virtually will do anything to avoid getting on the witness stand and saying I'm a victim. And I can't see any different, why it would be any different in, you know, when you have two men, the dynamics of two men.
Well, but there are differences too in terms of coming out. I mean, coming out as a victim is there's so much shame involved, and this is sort of double that.
Yes.
Because you're not just coming out as a victim, essentially, you're coming out now not only to the greater world, but to some extent really to yourself. The other thing, and I don't know, I know your research was about lesbians, but I think lesbians and maybe gay men as well tend to think that our relationships are really better.
Yeah.
You know, we just we put them on a pedestal in terms of how
Well, we're not like that.
perfect they're going to be. We're not like that. I mean, women are loving, women are gentle, women are kind, and oh boy, we got that's right. Lesbian utopia. So, what have you found in your research, in addition to this that you want to talk about, but about women's sort of responsibility or feelings about themselves?
Well, yeah, I guess, you know, I think that there has been this whole sort of need to kind of keep it in the closet, so to speak, because it does violate this idea that we've had about how, you know, our relationships are egalitarian, we don't have the same power issues that you see in heterosexual relationships, and women aren't violent and aggressive. And so it has made it very hard, I think, in the lesbian community for women to really acknowledge the violence that's going on, that either they're perpetrating or that it's being perpetrated, or even that they may see being perpetrated in a friendship, you know, but there's a couple where there's violence going on, because it blows that sort of myth of the lesbian community and the difference that we have. We have this corner on, you know, this egalitarian perfect relationship out of the water. And so it makes it very hard then to have to come out and acknowledge that we have some of the same struggles that heterosexual couples do in terms of power and control. And then it also means the fear of being pathologized by the larger heterosexual community. So it can become very hard.
Well, in your research too, you tell a little about how you conducted your research, because I think you interviewed.
Well, what I did was it was actually surveys that I sent out, and I just asked for lesbian couples who'd been together 6 months or more, and I got 90 samples back that I was able to use, 90 couples, and each partner filled out a questionnaire separate from their partner, and I looked at a variety of things in terms of frequency and severity of violence, different dynamics in the relationship, you know, work, all of those kinds of the basic things as well, demographics. And out of the 90 couples, 42 of the couples had repeated acts of violence. You know,
and this was just random.
This was just random.
Put it out in the world.
Just random. And so, and that's 46.6% of that sample. I just put it out there. Didn't say it was about domestic violence.
Are you saying just any physical force?
Physical,
a push all the way up to being pummeled.
Repeated.
Right.
Yeah, it was repeated acts over the past year. They had to have been, you know, done more than once. And of those couples where there was physical violence, there was also a great deal of emotional abuse, you know, intense psychological emotional abuse that was going on and some sexual abuse. And
So could you match up the responses of the two partners? Because I'm interested as there's a lot of denial in batterers, and I'm just fantasizing that one of them would set out all of this
Life is wonderful,
violence.
the other one, I'm getting
right,
pummeled.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right. Well, you know, see, I had them matched in a way, and what I looked at that does kind of get at what you're talking about is sort of what was the consistency rate like in the, because I broke them up into groups, right? Couples where there were repeated acts of violence and couples where there weren't. And what were the consistency rates of reporting like between the partners in both groups? And in the violent group, there was significant inconsistency between partners, you know, where one person was reporting, you know, this happened to me, I got beaten up, 5 times she beat me up in the past year. The other partner would be saying, no, it only happened once, that sort of thing. So a lot of inconsistency in that way. And the other thing that I found was a higher rate of alcohol and drug abuse in the violent group. And, you know, some other variables that are sort of complicated and, you know.
There also is a mythology that somehow alcohol and drug abuse causes violence.
Right.
But I know that among people who have gotten sober, who feel like, well, that takes care of that, I'm sure not going to be violent anymore, find to their chagrin that they still are. That this is not, maybe the alcohol or the drugs can help you get over your inhibitions against doing this kind of violence, if you have any. Or you use it, and victims self-medicate as well. But
It becomes an excuse. Not a
right,
cause.
I mean, in sober couples, we know that this also goes on.
Right.
So.
AIDS and HIV diagnoses are also cited as excuses that a lot of gay men use.
For a
Say more
batterer or
about
for the
that.
victim?
Both of them use drugs and alcohol as well as HIV status to excuse violence in terms of, well, he was just diagnosed, or he just got the diagnosis of AIDS, of course he was upset.
Right.
Why should he not have hit me? Or, you know, I told him I didn't like it, or something like that.
Right.
The victim uses it as well as the batterer. Oh, I just couldn't help it. I just gotten my diagnosis. How could I have not been upset?
Jan, this is interesting too. I wanted to check something with you. A friend of mine who works with HIV positive women has found that sometimes men will be sexually violent when they're HIV positive, straight men, or bisexual men, and as an aspect of assault or violence, will have forced sex with them unprotected, and they then become HIV positive. Do you see anything like this in the, or that you've ever seen in the gay community, that batterers will be less caring about safe sex as an aspect of their abuse of their partners?
We haven't seen that in our group, probably because we do a volunteer population only.
That would be an awful thing to admit,
Yes.
too, in a way, and I'm not sure whether people really see it. But you know, that aspect of it, it sort of exacerbates the. It's another kind of violence that can
Yes.
be done to a person.
Right. It becomes
The-
a
Pretty
tool.
extreme
Yes.
kind of violence.
Yes,
I mean, you're
the-
talking about possibly killing them
Yes.
ultimately.
Yes, infecting them. The book entitled Men Who Beat the Men Who Love Them really talks about the effect of AIDS and HIV in gay male battering and discusses that aspect of it. But we haven't seen it.
Want to come back to all of this? Well, we're going to take a break. Don't go away. There's still another, 20 minutes more.
Why would anybody give someone they don't know a gift? They do it because this gift saves lives, and the need for it is desperate. Please give blood. There's a life to be saved right now. Call the American Red Cross at 1-800-GIVE-LIFE.
Hi, welcome back to Get Used to It. Today we're talking about domestic violence in our lesbian gay community. Yes, there is some. We've tried to keep it a secret for various reasons, but there is some. We were talking about sort of the way domestic violence manifests itself in our relationships, particularly we try to keep it all a secret, we're afraid of coming out, but what about the rest of the world in terms of the way they look at our relationships? Laura, do you see many cases come to the prosecutor's office?
Well, recently there's been a change in California law that eliminated the opposite sex requirement. Under 273.5, there was a requirement that the parties be opposite sex. Now it's just people who are cohabiting with a intimate relationship and some permanence. I see that that's going to make a difference. It's going to make a difference because that is what's called a wobbler in our state, which means it could be a felony or a misdemeanor. And it requires the police to make an arrest if there's an actual visible injury. I think one of the problems with particularly males is that you have two men, and I think the attitude is, and it's not just homophobic, although I'm sure there's plenty of that involved, but the attitude is, well, they're two guys, must be a fair fight. You know, everybody can protect themselves, or with women, must be a cat fight kind of thing, you know, and everyone can protect themselves, so you guys just, you know, knock your heads against the wall, and we're leaving, figure it out yourself. With the change in the law, it's now required that an arrest be made. Of course, our problem is getting police officers not to arrest both people, but making a logical determination of who the aggressor was.
Well, there's a lot of this feeling that that if one person acts in self-defense, that you've got mutual combat. I mean, we were talking about that the other day. So how do we sort of go against that notion?
Right, it is very confusing, and a lot of people think that there could be mutual battering, especially when someone fights back and uses self-defense. And part of what you really have to do is do a really good assessment, like talking about the police officers as therapists, to really get the whole sequence of events and the sequence of the relationship. The whole atmosphere of the relationship is really what helps you understand, you know, is there intimidation going on? Because sometimes someone may do, like I may do a physical act to you first as a way of trying to sort of protect myself because I know what's coming, or I'm trying to get, you know, I know that sooner or later I'm going to get it and I'm taking a little control back. And then I can be confused and think that I'm battering, you feel victimized, and it's very confusing for the partners, it's confusing for the people on the outside, for the police, and you have to really get an assessment of the whole relationship.
Well, I think
Go ahead, Laura.
I think for law enforcement, the need for law enforcement, whether it be prosecution or police, is we have to be able to say, okay, both people have injuries, but let's make a determination, is there one set that are defensive wounds? You know, I mean, if someone has you down and they're choking you, and you have a handprint around your neck and maybe, you know, a swollen jaw or whatever, and the other person has scratches on their neck, now theoretically, and I have seen it happen all too many times, both parties can be arrested in this state because the officers have relinquished any kind of discretion, and it's like, okay, well, you both got injuries, I'm going to cover myself, you're both going. This is the kind of thing I think we need to fight against. We have to say, you know, use your common sense. You know, somebody has a hand on your throat and the other guy has scratches. How do you think he got that? Well, most likely by trying to get you off his throat.
Well, some states have adopted a definition that includes primary aggressor, so that it asks law enforcement to look at who not only initiated, but the word primary has something to do with seriousness of the injury, you know, to make a judgment, because in heterosexual couples where there's kids, or in our community where there's kids, you don't want both these people being...
And pets.
Now, what about pets?
For a lot of gay and lesbian couples, pets seem to perform the same function of companionship, of caring, of nurturing, and a threat against the pet can be just as traumatic as threats against the children.
As a matter of fact, it's not just traumatic, but it's a very effective way to take control over someone. Instead of, you know, you say, and they do, I mean, I've seen lots of cases where animals are hurt by way of showing you what's going to happen to you.
We just tried one where a guy, it was a heterosexual couple, but he took a cute little fluffy, I mean serious, and killed the dog by slamming it up against the wall purposely, and purposely killed it. And it was by way of saying, I'm going, you know, this is you.
You're next, right?
You know, this is you.
So, in the gay and lesbian cases, do you prosecute them the same way?
Yes, I mean, we prosecute them in the same way that our preparation and everything is the same, the statutes are the same. I think a trial attorney has got to look at it in a different way, in that there are going to be different things that come up. First of all, we have to realize that in front of some juries we have less sympathetic victims to the jury. I mean, I'll never forget, we had one case where a young woman was a victim, and she had a tattoo that said "dyke" around her throat. I mean, those are kinds of things that you're going to have to think, I'm going to have to say something to this jury. You know, this jury, you don't want your victim to be disliked, because they're much more likely to take the aggressor's position. And one of the problems with this dual aggressor, two people, is that if the police officer can't make a decision, I can tell you that a jury won't.
Right.
They will just throw up their hands and say mutual combat or self-defense, or how can I reasonably say who started it? And so I think that you know, everyone has to look at it in a commonsensical manner.
And how do friends and family respond to these issues? I mean, first of all, we've talked about the problem of having to come out about it.
Right.
Because you can't say, you know, my roommate's beating me up and I don't want to leave my roommate.
Right, right, right.
Duh, we finally got it, as if they didn't know anyway. But supposing that your family knows you're in this relationship and you try to get some help, have you had any experience with how family and friends respond, Jan?
Often family responds by kind of rooting for the breakup of the relationship. And so, well, yes, we want to encourage this, so they'll break up. And friends, on the other hand, can really encourage staying together no matter what, because friends often have an investment in our relationships continuing. Because if we break up, then they might break up, or it'll destroy their social, you know, situation, that sort of thing. And so friends and family can really respond in opposite ways that way. However, for gay and lesbian couples, it's friends who's often the adoptive family and who are there and present to influence it.
And a lot of minimization and denial that goes on, you know, because you don't want to think that that could be happening to your friends, or that, you know, this is going on next door. So sort of just kind of turning the other way, or not really taking it as serious as it really is.
And lesbian and gay victims both get told the line that women were told for centuries and centuries of, just try harder, try not to upset him, try not to upset her, try to make it work. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute, that could be lethal.
And also the sort of the extra thing in terms of the political part of it. It took women so long to talk about this, and now it's become a very political thing. But it's been a lot, shall we say, to a great extent, white women for a long time talking about this. Women of color are having more problems talking about it. There are individuals who do. You know, it certainly happens, but it's more of a threat to a community that's already under threat. You know, now they're going to think not only are we this, this, and this, but we're violent. And that's a bad thing to be. So I've seen it in a number of communities. I'll never forget, I did a panel for 200 Jewish women about 8-9 years ago. It was a luncheon program, and they threw rolls at us on the panel that we should dare suggest that a Jewish man, you know, would batter. Well, this doesn't happen anymore. I mean, of course, we have enormous numbers of examples that this happens in every family, but our community is also still going, let's not let anybody know about this, because they already hate us, and now they're going to think we're violent instead of these idealized relationships that we have.
And this is a downer. Why we don't really want to have you come and talk about this. I mean, I've been told that by community groups, where other community groups have wanted me to go as a speaker to do some education, and the other people sort of, you know, running the group or whatnot are, well, I don't know, this is such a downer. Why would we want to talk about this? You know,
why make ourselves look bad?
Right.
Well, but we've got to, I think, start, and certainly there has been a start because of the work that all of you are doing, but in terms of the audience that we reach, even with this show, I think it's important to sort of make some very firm statements about what we should do. I mean, this is an issue, as you know, that I've been working on for 20 years, mostly in the heterosexual community. But first of all, I think we want people to take violence very seriously in their relationships. It is dangerous.
Yes.
My partner, when we informing the Women's Law Center, Abby Liebman, her twin sister was just murdered last month by her husband, the sister's husband. And everyone says, was there any violence? Did he beat her? And the answer was, no, there was an enormous amount of emotional violence. She was afraid for the children, but she was leaving. And so they make that leap, you know, you're not going to leave me, and it was murder. So we have got to know how serious this is for us too, that it can be life-threatening, and we need to get out.
Interesting enough, it can be life-threatening at the point that you say you're leaving.
Yes, that's
Your
the most
greatest likelihood of severe violence is at the time you leave your batterer or attempt to leave your batterer. And
40% of the women murdered in this country are murdered by their partners, and usually as they're trying to leave. A dangerous situation.
On the other hand, we don't want to give the message that you better just stay.
Right.
So the answer to that is really resources, don't you think? I mean, it is resources that as a community, if we're not engaged in such a relationship, we need to be there for our friends who are. We need to help them identify it and get out of it. I mean, what kind of resources would you advise friends and family who are concerned to think about using realistically for our community?
well, I can tell you one thing. I mean, one thing is to call the police. You know, the interesting thing is that we find that instances of battering go down or stop. You can control it by bringing the police in. Your biggest problem is, I know we just said that your worst problem is when you try to leave, and that, you know, that's an unfortunate paradox, but when you call the police in, you have a much better likelihood of controlling that situation, of stopping that situation. And so from our perspective, get us involved. You know, certainly here in Los Angeles, I mean, I can't vouch for other places around the country, but get us involved. We're here, we're willing. Our unit is going to have a deputy that is specially assigned to do gay and lesbian battering cases. And so, you know, we're here to be involved, so we'd be real happy to do that.
The center also has facilities for dealing with this, so we have crisis walk-in every day where people can come in and ask for help, and we can take action. We also have one of the most comprehensive referral sources at the center of anywhere, listing all the shelters, therapists, all the resources for men and for women, and it's very, very, very helpful. The therapists and the counselors in the department are getting educated and becoming much more aware of dynamics to look for, how to assess this, who to refer to, all of these.
Right, and not just for Los Angeles, but there are also resources all over the country that have, you know, in the last few years have started to be developed and that are ongoing, and, you know, in terms of shelter or helplines, that sort of thing.
A couple of the shelters in Los Angeles have specifically made room for battered lesbians.
Yes.
But
not men.
Where do battered gay men go?
There's one shelter that will take men, straight or gay.
Oh, really?
In the LA area.
Yeah, you're talking about Oasis in Lancaster?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about therapists, Val? What should a therapist do? They learn about this within the context of the therapist-client relationship. What can they do?
Well, you're talking about in an individual situation? That, you know, first, if a therapist doesn't have any knowledge about domestic violence, they need to go out and get consultation and really educate themselves. And it's important, you know, let's say if you're working with a batterer, it's important to hold them accountable, but not be punitive. I mean, if we're going to really heal our communities, we have to understand both the batterers and the victims. So accountability is a very important thing. And, you know, the therapist needs to be able to be non-judgmental, but be holding the client accountable. And working with battered partners, the therapist also needs to be very supportive and empowering of that person, and not pushing them necessarily, though, to leave the relationship. Because one, that can be very dangerous. Two, the man or woman may not be at a place where psychologically they feel like they can leave the relationship. Or financially. I mean, there could be all kinds of reasons, as we talked about, good reasons why the person may be staying. So to help empower them to be able to make decisions and use resources that are out there, contact the police, contact the center, get involved in a battered lesbian, battered gay men's support group, something like that.
It's not easy.
No.
I mean, that's the thing that people have to understand. It's not easy to leave a relationship. It's not easy to stop battering. It's not easy to ask for help. Often the police may not be very helpful.
That's right.
Often the justice system may not be very helpful. Well, we're just at the beginning of really dealing with this concern, and I want to thank all three of you for the work that you're doing and for being on the show and for sharing with us really what you've experienced and what you know. I think there have not been really very many exposures about battering in our community, and it's a really important thing for us to be talking about. So thank you all very, very much.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
want you to pay attention as well. If you're a victim or a batterer, reach out for some help. If you're family or neighbors or friends, be sure that you're there for the victim. Don't aid and abet any of this stuff. If you're organizing in your community to help the gay and lesbian community, make sure that this is a part of it. If you're part of the domestic violence movement in any way, make sure that you're aware and sensitive to these issues. And now that I've given you all your assignments for this month, thank you very much for being here. And remember, we're here, we're queer, get used to it.